Good morning. I'm Rosalind Layton, founder of China Tech Threat. We study the problem of information technology produced by firms owned and affiliated by the People's Republic of China. And we suggest policy solutions to protect the privacy, security, and prosperity of Americans. Welcome to today's event, Unacceptable Risk, Expanding the FCC's Covered List to Reflect Reality. As you may know, the Federal Communications Commission is in the midst of a proceeding on this very topic. Congress has instructed the FCC to create a covered list. It is a list of firms which pose an unacceptable risk to America's national security. And the FCC has the authority to provide equipment authorizations for all products that use radio frequencies. Presently, there are 5 firms on the FCC's list, and the FCC has been engaged in a bipartisan process as instructed by Congress as to what degree do they expand or update, add or delete firms to that particular list, and to what degree do those firms are authorized to market their equipment in the US. China Tech Threat has filed in this proceeding. You can see our filings at chinatechthreat.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at China Tech Threat. So welcome to today's discussion. We are ready to get underway. We're very pleased to have Brendan Carr of the Federal Communications Commission. He is the senior commissioner of the Republican side. He is a champion of many things, including getting Americans online safely and efficiently. And he has crisscrossed the nation, working at the local level to get 5G enabled. He's climbed up towers and helped learn about how the networks get installed. And he's also worked on the framework for 5G and other advanced generation networks. And the leadership that the U.S. has today is in large part the credit to Brendan Carr. So now we're going to turn our attention to another key aspect of this, which is making our internet connection safe and protecting against national security risk. So I'm very pleased today to present Commissioner Carr, and he's going to talk to us about this proceeding, what it means, and where we go from here. So welcome, Commissioner.
Oh, thank you so much, Roz, for the kind introduction. Thank you for all of your important advocacy and work in this space and helping to highlight the importance of advancing America's security when it comes to the supply chain, when it comes to infrastructure. You know, this is an issue that we've been very focused on at the FCC over the last couple of years. Starting back in 2018, I was pushing for the FCC to not just consider stopping to subsidize effectively Huawei and ZTE gear going into our networks, but to put on the table the idea of actually removing that insecure gear from our communications network, a process that has now been referred to as rip and replace, and one that we're now actively engaged in right now, finalizing the process to do that rip and replace based on the very real national security threats that come from Huawei, ZTE, similar gear. Back in 2019, then, I called for the FCC to start a top to bottom review of every telecom carrier with ties to communist China based on the threats that we were seeing. And since then, the FCC launched a proceeding to revoke the authorizations of several carriers with ties to the communist regime. And in fact, we've taken several steps, and we have a few final steps to go to get that across the finish line. But we're now engaged in that very process, which I think is great. And then earlier this year, I called for the FCC to use our equipment authorization process to safeguard against security threats. Because after all, if we're prohibiting Huawei or ZTE gear from going into the networks using federal dollars, we call Universal Service Fund dollars, we had this massive loophole that was if you aren't using federal dollars to put that gear in your networks, then you weren't prohibited from putting it in there. And the reality is the very real security threat from this gear comes from its presence in the network, not the source of the dollars used to fund it. So I'm glad that the FCC started a process. In fact, our comment cycle just closed on this proposal to deny equipment authorization, which is effectively the approval you need to use these devices at all in the U.S., regardless of the source of funding used to purchase it. That comment cycle just closed, and I think that we should move quickly to an order on that. And again, these are issues that have broad bipartisan support on this last piece of looking at our equipment authorization, there's bipartisan, bicameral legislation right now in Congress that would direct us to complete that very rulemaking. On the House side, it's led by Congressman Scalise and Congresswoman Eshoo. On the Senate side, it's led by Senator Rubio and Senator Markey. So we need to get that across the finish line. And, to some extent, that brings us up to the current moment. And part of why I've been so interested in this issue has been the very real threat that these entities pose. It was a year or two ago, I was up in Great Falls, Montana at Malmstrom Air Force Base. And this is where we maintain some of the ICBMs that are buried in underground silos dotted all across that portion of northern Montana. And they need to be ready to go at a moment's notice. And when you spend time up there, across these hundreds of miles, there's just nothing up there. It's wheat fields and it's sort of blue sky country. And that's about it, except dotted through that missile silo field are these cell towers running high-powered Huawei gear that seem to be over-provisioned given the lack of population density up there. And I think that was sort of a further kick forward for us to get that proceeding going. But there's more that we need to do. We need to add to the FCC's covered list. We have, Huawei and about 4 other entities that are on there right now. But one of the most important things that we need to do with that covered list is to keep it up to date. Immediately putting entities on the covered list obviously bars them from getting that gear subsidized through federal USF. But more broadly, again, it has to do with this broader proceeding we have, which is we're looking at whether anything on that covered list should also be denied equipment authorization in the U.S. And I think one of the most important steps that we should take is to immediately start the process of adding DJI, which is a Chinese drone company, to the FCC's covered list. And most people probably don't understand the vast amounts of sensitive data that's being collected today by DJI drones in this country. DJI right now has the lion's share of the market for commercial drones in the U.S. Their market share exceeds 50%. And their drones and the surveillance technology that runs on top of those platforms collect all sorts of data, everything from high-res images of critical infrastructure to use by various state and local law enforcement and public safety agencies, facial recognition technology, and even remote sensors that from a distance can measure an individual's body temperature and heart rate. And on top of all that, security research has found that DJI's software applications that run on the smartphones that operate those drones themselves are collecting large quantities of personal information from the operator's smartphone that could be exploited by Beijing. Indeed, there was one former Pentagon official that said that, quote, "We know that a lot of the information is sent back to China," end quote, from these DJI drones. So when you step back and consider the vast troves of sensitive data that these DJI drones are collecting, it's really troublesome, particularly because there's this China national security law that grants the Chinese government the power to compel DJI to assist it in espionage activities, and their willingness to engage in questionable activities in coordination with the Chinese surveillance state is pretty well known. In fact, the Commerce Department placed DJI on the Commerce Department's entity list last year, citing DJI's role in Communist China's surveillance and abuse of Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region. And again, when you add to all of that, the widespread use of DJI drones today by law enforcement agencies, including recent reports that the Secret Service and FBI recently acquired DJI drones, the need for quick FCC action on this is very clear. In the process going forward is one that the FCC needs to commence. We need to coordinate with law enforcement agencies. There's various mechanisms by which you can get added to the FCC's covered list. Most of them involve the input of other entities outside the FCC. So I think the FCC needs to start that process, that consultation process, immediately. If there's evidence, mitigating evidence that I'm unaware of, we need to get it out there, because the evidence that I've seen so far shows that we should very much proceed down this path of putting DJI on the covered list. And the evidence against DJI has been mounting for years. In fact, you can look at various components of the federal government that on their own have taken individual actions with respect to DJI, but yet it's been inconsistent, and there hasn't been a comprehensive plan in place to deal with the real threat from DJI. And that's why I think the FCC starting that consultation process is a very good and necessary next step. In terms of the evidence, I have a release that I'll send around that walks through some of this, but in a nutshell, all the way back in 2017, there was an intelligence bulletin from a DHS field office that stated that DJI is likely providing sensitive U.S. infrastructure and law enforcement data back to the Chinese government. In 2019, in passing the fiscal year 20 NDAA, Congress broadly prohibited the Pentagon, DoD, from purchasing Chinese-made drones, including DJI, which again is sort of the dominant share of the commercial market in the U.S., based on national security concerns. Back in January of 2020, the Secretary of the Department of Interior issued an order that largely grounded the department's fleet of drones, most notably DJI drones, based on concerns about cybersecurity and safeguarding sensitive information. One of the DOJ's component groups prohibited the use of their funds from being used to purchase what they called covered foreign entity drones, including the DJI ones. There's additional evidence, but most recently in July of 21, the DoD stated that it remains convinced that DJI systems, quote, pose potential threats to national security, end quote, that those drones, DJI drones, are still barred from use by DoD. So when you look at where we've come, which I think is a long way towards identifying and standing up to the threat posed by communist China to our security of our communication systems, the realization that Huawei poses a very real threat. I think what we're seeing right now with DJI is the potential for Huawei on wings, and we don't need an airborne version of Huawei. And when you look again at just the vast amounts of sensitive data, body temperature, heart rate, high-res images of critical infrastructure that can be collected, and then couple that with the Chinese national security law and the concerns already expressed by components of the federal government about the access to this information by Beijing, there is enough there where I am very concerned. I think all of us should be very concerned. I think the appropriate step is to commence a process of adding them to the FCC's covered list.
Well, excellent. And thank you for sharing that with us, Commissioner. I applaud your work. I applaud the Commission for highlighting the dangers of DJI drones and taking the necessary steps to take the action item to get them on the list. Now, for the benefit of our listeners, let me just summarize a couple of those things, just, in the let's say the folks who don't exactly understand what we're talking about, but in the sense that when we talk about Huawei, the real issue there is what we call the back channel or the control channel, that any information flowing across the Huawei network has a connection to Beijing. And that's also bolstered by their country's security and intelligence laws. Now, when we talk about DJI, you talk about the Huawei on wings. We have an unmanned aerial vehicle. We've got a drone, a computer that's basically flying around. As I recall, it crashed on the White House lawn not a couple of years ago. So there, as you pointed out, you also have the capability where these devices can be accessed remotely without the authorization of the owner or the user. That's an issue. Then you've got the data going back to Chinese servers where they're going to be processed in the same systems that are used for repression and surveillance in China. So whether it's social credit system, it's which is used to judge people on every kind of action. Do you jaywalk, your financial information? It's a drop in the bucket to add another 330 million people to China's surveillance state of 2 billion. That's nothing. In fact, they've been doing that for a lot of Americans for quite a few years now. So you're absolutely right that the threat is there, and it makes perfect sense with DJI. as you lay out. And it isn't just an issue for the military. There are we're losing over $600 billion in the US to intellectual property theft from China. All kinds of companies, individuals and enterprises, creators, content creators, they're using DJI drones. And I would say, as you pointed out, it's almost the only drone you can buy. I mean, it has almost, it's growing monopoly market share. So other let's say PRC made drones have a hard time to get into the market because of the sort of monopoly position of DJI. So it makes a lot of sense. Maybe if you could talk about, for us, your process. Obviously, you described the various agencies. You have the Defense Department, which can say, well, look, we don't want the Defense Department to use it. You can have Department of Commerce, which can say, well, restrict certain companies from transacting with DJI. But it kind of leaves in the lurch the consumer, because it still means any company can go out and buy this, whether or not they realize the risk. State governments can go out and buy these products, law enforcement, local, state level, as you said. So obviously this is one area where the FCC can act. So, tell us, as you think about, these are not the only companies of concern. We can use, already there's 44 firms on the Pentagon's list of Chinese military companies, DJI being one. You have companies like Lenovo, which has been described by the United States China Commission as a Huawei of laptops and computers. You've got YMTC, which is semiconductors. They're embedded in a lot of these devices. They can operate a kill switch and turn off the device in which it's embedded. You've got TikTok, which has also been described. So there's really a lot of companies out there. And how do you, when you look at what's ahead of you, and your mandate from Congress is to keep this covered list up to date, how are you going to process literally the long list of Chinese companies? And of course, it's not Brendan Carr's choice. I mean, you're going to get strict instructions from the security agencies, but how can you get it all done?
Well, there's some great points in there, and you're right. DJI has taken market share or obtained market share in the U.S. through a lot of the hallmark moves in terms of pricing moves included that we had seen before when Huawei was looking to take market share. And when we make decisions about what entities to add to the covered list, or in my case, to suggest entities to add to the covered list, there is a wide range of information sources that we use to do that. We've never, for instance, put forward adding an entity to the list simply because it is based in or headquartered in China. There are always a series of plus factors above and beyond that we have cited. And obviously, in this case, I think DJI has a significant number of those plus factors. Again, you've got multiple components of the federal government either barring the purchase of them, grounding their fleets, Congress expressing concern in the NDAA, the security researchers that are identifying potential issues with the mobile application that people are using. So I think there's a sufficient number of additional plus factors that raise concerns. And again, when we first started talking about the threat from Huawei at the federal level in 2017 and 2018, there was a lot of people that looked at that skeptically, and it was a bit of an uphill climb to make that case because people weren't really willing to accept the potential threat that it posed. Well, obviously, flash forward to today, and everyone really understands the serious threat posed by Huawei. I think we're in a very similar position potentially when it comes to DJI, which is, I'm not the first person to call this a potential security threat. Obviously, these federal agencies have taken action, but it's been inconsistent. And I think, now is the time that we bring together the components to make these final decisions, because you're right. When we say, DOD can't fly a drone, but yet companies can, individuals can, and it can still be accessing just information on people on the street in terms of heart rate, temperature, other biometrics. It's been used in sort of furtherance of COVID lockdowns around the globe, this type of drone-based technology. So just give you a sense of the various applications that it's been had. So I do think there is a process that we use, and there's a lot of reasons why, DJI checks a sufficient number of boxes that it's time to move forward in a more comprehensive way with them.
Well, and you also referenced the Secure Equipment Act of 2021, which I think is a very broad bipartisan effort in the Senate and the House. You've got Markey and Rubio in the Senate, and in the House you have Scalise and Eshoo. So, you know, really titans of Congress pushing forward essentially a bill that is affirming the FCC's job with the covered list, outlining a roadmap, if you will, that will say, you know, as the national security agencies make these pronouncements, the FCC has to act. And if I'm not mistaken, it would be the Public Safety Bureau of the FCC, which would perform, you know, which would be processing these designations and then, you know, maintaining the covered list, keeping it up to date. So it is in, you know, maybe a challenging time in America. This still is maybe one of the most bipartisan issues there.
Yeah, I think, look, for a long time and on a bipartisan basis, I think policy and lawmakers inside the Beltway missed the very real threat posed by communist China, or underestimated or assumed that, certain actions involving bringing them into various international organizations would fundamentally change the approach of the Communist Party. And I think that belief, which was in place on a bipartisan basis, has failed. I think what we're now seeing is replacing it a commitment on a bipartisan basis to meeting the very real threat that Communist China plays. And you're right, in a time of substantial polarization in Washington, standing up to the threats posed by Communist China is a welcome bipartisan commitment, as evidenced by that legislation, bipartisan. There may be some action on that legislation in Congress this week. I think all that is a good sign. I think it's a signal to the FCC that we should move forward with our rulemaking, potentially by the end of the year, to get that across the finish line. I think that would be a really important step.
Well, that's great. So, as you said, the comments closed. There was a comment period closed yesterday. What happens now? I mean, will this be put up for be put on an FCC commission meeting for an item? What will go on in the commission at this point?
Well, as the NPRM, which again was proposing that we take our covered list and effectively deny equipment authorization approval to any entity on that list. That proposal, as you noted, the comment cycle has recently closed on that. And usually the way it works at the FCC is, the staff will complete their review of the record. And then at that point will be a decision to move to an order, whichever way a majority of the commission decides to go on resolving that. But that should be capable of teeing up for final action by the FCC in the not too distant future. At this point, there's not a need necessarily for additional notice or comment or additional step between now and a final decision on the proposal to ban equipment authorization for devices, companies and their devices that are on the covered list.
Excellent. Well, I thank you for coming to China Tech Threat and sharing with us this important update. And you're always welcome. I hope that you'll come again and tell us how things are going. And at this point, we're going to go over to our panel and get their reactions. We are joined today by some really leading scholars on national security and defense, and who've participated in this process over the last 3 years. So we're really pleased that we could bring you this exciting discussion. We have Martijn Rasser from Center for New American Security. We have Jordan Bruner, who is a newly minted national security attorney. We have Emily Weinstein from Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. And we have Colin Andrews for the Telecommunications Industry Association. If I'm not mistaken, is the oldest telecom equipment association in the US. At any rate, it's been around a long time, and it's wonderful to have all of you with us. Panel, reactions to Commissioner Carr and his announcement that he's going to be going, he wants to add DJI to the covered list, and he's calling it a Huawei with wings. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll just jump in. I think that's very welcome news. The security risks associated with DJI, as the commissioner laid out, are well known, and he gave a good summary of why this is the right way forward on this. So I applaud him for that, and I definitely commend him for the very catchy phrase "Huawei with wings." It's very memorable. But yeah, no, that's exactly the type of action that the U.S. government needs to be taking, not just for DJI, but I think there's other companies that would warrant being added to the covered list as well as to the entity list. So, but very encouraging step.
Sure, and I would also just echo what Martin just said and add, it seems that the U.S. government is really focusing more now kind of on the software issues and controlling software. You know, this came up a little bit with TikTok and WeChat recently and with the commerce ICTS rule, but I think this is one of the first examples that we're seeing, at least at the FCC level, of really focusing again on kind of the software, where the software is going, particularly when we're talking about DJI and kind of linking back to people's cell phones.
And, you know, just adding a perspective of the process on this, this is really amazing to watch, you know, from the genesis of the whole rip and replace era back in 2018. Carr even hit at this, that the conversation was a bit different. And, you know, speaking for TIAA, we've always been pushing for a whole of government approach, focusing on the process of how to add these entities to this list. And it needs to be done with agencies of national security expertise, and the calling to, you know, bring more scrutiny onto this and start that process. It's great to actually just see it, you know, from its genesis onto how it will actually be done past these 5 companies that are already on.
And just to echo what everyone else has said, I agree with the commissioner's announcement today that DJI should be added to the covered list. I think also a number of other companies, as Martin said, should be added to the covered list as well, including Chinese military companies that make equipment that falls underneath the terms of the Secure Networks Act.
Well, thank you all for that. So, you know, exciting morning here of what's going on at the FCC. Let's go into our, you know, some of your areas of expertise and how you might shed light on the FCC's proceeding and advise them. You know, Martijn, let's go back to you. You know, you are really looking at security from the big picture. And you have, of course, you know, you've written a lot about Huawei, and I know that you support what the FCC's done there. You know, but as we discussed, we're sort of at the tip of the iceberg here. I mean, there are, let's say, if we look at, you know, technology in the People's Republic of China, you know, semiconductors is a big deal. All of this electronic equipment, there's millions of devices. They have semiconductors. They're made by military fabs like YMTC. You know, is that you know, a company that should be added to the covered list? And, you know, tell us how you see the FCC should go forward.
Yeah, in terms of the covered list, a company like YMTC, I think there's a strong case to be made that it should be added as well. Part of the problem that we're having, of course, with this broader technology competition with China is the scale and scope of the problem. What I do think we should think about seriously is how we address these challenges. Yes, there's, of course, an important role for the covered list and the Department of Commerce's entity list. But fundamentally, we need to really start focusing on where we truly have leverage, right? What are the choke point technologies where the United States, as well as its allies and partners, can really have meaningful impact on China's ability to, you know, subvert these technologies in ways that just do not comport with our norms and values, as well as, of course, safeguarding our economic competitiveness, our economic security, and our national security. And we need to think more strategically, ultimately, if we want to be able to have long-term impact, because eventually it just becomes a game of whack-a-mole, right? Where you keep going after individual companies. But as we've seen, the Chinese have been very good at creating cutout companies, intermediaries. They changed the name of existing entities. It just uses up a lot of U.S. government resources in order to stay on top of that. So one thing that I would propose is that we really focus on, as I mentioned before, these choke point technologies, such as semiconductor manufacturing equipment, where we have a true strategic advantage. So just some food for thought as we continue the discussion today.
That's a great point, and I would direct our listeners to a website that we have at China Tech Threat called The Future of BIS, where we've really made a deep dive into the semiconductor question. We're looking at Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, and all of the policy issues related to how does it address these semiconductor questions. I'm going to turn to Jordan, and I would say, you know, maybe today's announcement's not a surprise for you, given that you have really written chapter and verse and submitted it to the FCC on DJI. I would note you also described Lenovo. You talked about TikTok. And maybe walk us through, from your perspective as a national security attorney, that this isn't sort of invented out of nowhere. There is a roadmap, and maybe that what Carr is doing today, he's following exactly what Congress has laid out.
Correct. So as you said, he's following the framework that Congress has laid out in the Secure Networks Act. It was introduced in 2019 by Representative Pallone as part of this idea of trying to deal with security vulnerabilities in the supply chain for the United States, specifically equipment coming from China. So there's 4 ways to actually get on the covered list. The first way is for a determination to be made by an interagency process, specifically focusing on national security. So for example, CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, might make a determination that DJI presents a threat to national security. So that's one way. The second way is for the Commerce Department under Executive Order 13873 to actually make that same kind of determination that it presents a threat to national security. The third way is for it to be designated under Section 889F3 of the 2019 NDAA. And the NDAA is the National Defense Authorization Act, for those of you that don't know. It's a way for Congress to sort of designate things dealing with national security. And then the final way is for an appropriate national security agency to designate equipment. And that's defined as the Department of Defense, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and a few other agencies. So specific to DJI, the Defense Department has determined that there are cybersecurity vulnerabilities when it comes to DJI drones or unmanned aerial vehicles. And so that's a way that it can be placed on the covered list. Congress has mandated that any time that some of those determinations have been made, that equipment be placed on the covered list. So it's not really an option. And the commission has also noted that it's not an option. Another company that's actually hit 3 out of the 4 is TikTok. The Commerce Department has designated it under Executive Order 13873. CFIUS has designated it as a national security threat based on its ownership by the Chinese company ByteDance. And both DOD, FBI, and DHS have all said that it's a national security threat based on its collection of information and its closeness to the communist regime. So Commissioner Carr's call today is really valuable. And the companies really should have been on the list already based on their designation by those agencies. In addition, there are communist Chinese military companies that should probably be on the list as well if they make equipment that falls underneath the terms of the Secure Networks Act. And this is under Section 889F3 of the 2019 NDAA subpart D, which says that any company that is owned or controlled by the communist government in China actually should be on the covered list. And those companies that I mentioned, the Chinese military companies, have been designated by the Defense Department as being owned, controlled, or affiliated with the Chinese government. So that's my sort of 2 cents on that.
Well, excellent. I think that people should certainly read your filing. It's very helpful in describing that. Emily, let me turn to you. I think as Martijn described here, there's a sort of a subterfuge or workarounds going on. It doesn't take a genius to figure out, oh, we're going to put XYZ company on a list. Well, let me change the name or let me find some sort of workaround. So maybe you can talk to us about, that sort of slippery slope. But maybe more largely, you have an expertise in something called military civil fusion, a sort of strategy used by the Chinese government. And from my estimation, or it's been printed at least in a few places, that there's at least 900 information technology companies in China that are working as part of this strategy. So given that, we have a lot of firms in front of us. What are your thoughts about, what the FCC is doing now, and how do you see going forward?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And I can kind of start at the highest levels and make my way back down to the telecommunications companies specifically. But what we see is China's military civil fusion development strategy that's existed for decades and has kind of been elevated under Xi Jinping has really created a system in which the lines between the military or defense and civilian sectors in China are very much blurred. It's very hard to tell to what extent an entity has a connection to the PLA, to the defense state-owned enterprises like AVIC, CETC, Norinco, kind of the, some of the big names, particularly as we're seeing some of these, the companies that Jordan mentioned, a lot of them, for instance, are some of these kind of quasi-private companies, Lenovo, ByteDance, things like that. So kind of how do we go about assessing where they fit, across a spectrum of, if this is a civilian company, this is a defense company, kind of where do they fit? So because of that, and this kind of obfuscation is something that China has done very purposefully. It's part of an effort to, again, like I said, blur those lines and make it less obvious when China is going out and establishing partnerships or working with, universities, companies, you name it, trying to kind of obfuscate any relation back to the military defense or even some of the surveillance apparatus stuff that Commissioner Carr mentioned earlier, especially with Xinjiang. So because of this, we end up, one of the first responses that we've seen on the part of the U.S. government has been to pull out things like the Chinese Communist Military Company list or Chinese military company lists. There's been a significant uptick in the use of the entity list under commerce. And now we have the OFAC CMIC list, the Chinese Military Industrial Complex Companies list, which is a mouthful. So we have a lot of these lists. There's a lot of efforts to try and, put more entities on this list. Back in December of 2020, I along with one of my colleagues at CSET, advocated for the addition of the 7 Sons of National Defense, which are 7 Chinese universities that have kind of really strong historical ties to the defense ecosystem in China. We advocated for them to be added to the entity list, and they were. So there are good things, obviously, to these lists. I think these lists, even standing as just kind of a list like the Chinese military company list that doesn't necessarily have any type of action associated with it, I think there's something to be said about creating these for due diligence purposes. So folks in academia and industry in the United States can have a better idea of, okay, this company shows up on this list that DoD or that Commerce has put out, so maybe let me think twice before doing a collaboration with them or a partnership. But as Martin kind of hinted at and others have hinted at as well, there are issues associated with these lists, especially when we're talking about China, because China is so quick to adapt to U.S. strategy, particularly when it comes to these lists. We've seen, for instance, in July of 2021, so just a few months back, AVIC's Hong Kong entity, which is, I think it was AVIC Hong Kong International Limited, something along those lines, which was kind of their big player as far as interacting with the rest of the world, because Hong Kong was such a prominent place for trade and interaction. We saw actually that AVIC changed the name of that company to something along the lines of Continental Technology, something kind of hearkening back to their acquisition of Continental, here in the United States a few years back. So they are now no longer called AVIC. They also specifically said in the filing that they are no longer using the AVIC logo. So this obviously has a number of implications as far as obfuscation, and I have yet to see kind of the impact that this is having on kind of any entity listing or export control things. But this is just one of many examples of China kind of responding to what the United States has done, whether this is completely disappearing terms, like we saw this with 1,000 Talents, we saw this with Made in China 2025, or if we see this kind of in more of a skirting export controls kind of idea, as we've seen maybe with AVIC and with other companies. So again, pluses and minuses to the list approach, but happy to see that there's, Colin mentioned this whole idea of a whole of government approach to these companies. And I think having the FCC on board with DJI and kind of moving forward with that is a great place to go.
That's great. We're going to turn to Colin in just a second, but Emily, just for clarification here, one of the key differences, I'm sorry, I've got a little bit of an echo there. Maybe Colin, let's go over to you. Talk about your group has been supporting the FCC's efforts for at least 3 years, and you are the representing hundreds, if I'm not mistaken, hundreds of different equipment companies, and you actually support these kind of restrictions. Maybe tell us why it is that TIAA has gotten involved, and what does this mean for your members? What does this mean for the marketplace, for competition? And how do you see, how will consumers benefit?
Sure. So just, quick 2-second background on TIAA. We're the Trusted Industry Association for the Connected World. So we're representing over 400 members of the ICT manufacturer and vendor community. So really at our core, our members are the trusted ICT supply chain. And that's why the issue of supply chain security has been so paramount to us and our mission. And, as Commissioner Carr mentioned in his remarks, when the first NPRM focusing on the rip and replacement of equipment that poses national security concerns was released by the FCC, the kind of tone about these issues was very different than what it is now. Largely, we were the only ones outright supporting the FCC's action in this. And that really, the FCC taking this and giving us for the first time an opportunity to discuss this on the federal record aided ICT industry in being able to actually discuss these kind of security concerns, because everyone is well aware about the predatory practices employed by Huawei and the like, allegations of widespread IP theft, a demonstrated record of more than $75 billion of subsidies from the Chinese government. But what's important to keep in mind here is that by not playing by the rules, they have had a negative impact on the rest of ICT industry. Specifically, Huawei rose with the help of state subsidies on the back of other trusted global ICT vendors. And thanks to the FCC really taking a lead in this space and allowing this to be discussed on the record, and then establishing concrete rules that affect these companies that pose a threat to national security, both with rip and replace and what we're expecting from the NPRM comment period that closed yesterday. It's allowed ICT to better situated to kind of counter these anti-competitive actions. And you see that outside of the US as well. This is manifested in decisions by our closest allies that have happened in the past 4 years to make decisions to remove this kind of equipment from their networks. In the past, it used to always be, if this is such a concern, why isn't the US doing something about it? So actions like the FCC in these proceedings allow us to point to direct action saying we're putting our money where the mouth is. It's, but as Emily mentioned, we've also always been focused on a whole of government approach, which, in our initial comments back in 2018, we hypothesized about the kind of process that does exist now thanks to the Secure Networks Act, where the FCC is not a sole actor in determining what poses a national security risk, but instead is working in concert with all government agencies. And that whole government approach is invaluable to allowing industry to point at the kind of costs. Even if something may be cheaper on paper, there's still a hidden cost when it comes to security and lack of building a trusted network. But at the end of the day, it's always been TIA's position that while government action is certainly welcome in narrow targeted areas of national security concerns, the ICT industry is really in the best position to govern their own supply chains and point out the critical vulnerabilities and risks. And that's why we've been working, in addition to being an advocacy industry association, we're also a longstanding designated organization. We've made over thousands of ICT standards over the past century, but one that we're working on to roll out at the end of the year is called SCS 9001, and it's a process-based standard aimed at adding transparency to the ICT supply chain. We're dealing with issues kind of more nebulous, like the trustworthy factor here, but also, provenance issues, quality management issues, counterfeit issues that we hope will, in conjunction with government action, such as what we're seeing from the FCC, really give other governments and vendors kind of all the information when it comes down to levels of trust in the ICT supply chain, which can get very complicated.
Well, thank you for TIAA for that leadership. I think having more transparency with regard to People's Republic of China would be a good thing. We cannot get enough of that. We have next to none presently. I want to take just a quick moment here for listeners. If you want to send in a question, you can do it at info@chinatechthreat.com. We'd be happy to take questions that you have. I still have a lot of questions for our excellent panelists. I'm going to come back to you, Martijn. It seems to me that, of course, the U.S. can do what's in its national interest. And, we talked about that today. But this is, it's a global economy. What's to stop when people say, well, look, I'm not going to sell my products in U.S. Should I go somewhere else? What is the role here for, international partnerships or international engagement on these kinds of questions?
Yeah, ultimately, it's going to be a matter of rallying the like-minded countries around the world to deal with these issues, right? If you think of just the diffusion of technology, the United States just cannot act unilaterally and be anywhere close as effective as it could be unless it aligns Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, countries like India on these matters. I've been writing a lot about this concept of a technology alliance, where ultimately you want these countries to collaborate together, right? If you consider in terms of human capital, R&D spending, S&T infrastructure, the techno democracies of the world, if they align themselves more effectively, have huge strategic advantages over China. A lot of the issues that we're facing right now, both from an economic and national security standpoint, become much more manageable if we have better collaboration between these countries. And part of that, of course, is the protective aspects, right? Export controls and sanctions. But much more of that is the affirmative, proactive things that we can be doing, like joint R&D efforts, looking at remapping supply chains, for example, where you can have significant cost savings if you're trying to establish a secure semiconductor supply chain, for instance. Right now you have various countries really putting a lot of money towards new fabrication capacity, which is fine, but you need to coordinate with each other to make sure that you're not creating overly redundant capabilities. But there's also the fact that you need to look at the design aspect and the packaging and testing of semiconductors. Until we start better coordination on these types of efforts, you're just going to see a lot of wasted effort, and ultimately that will be at cross purposes to what we're trying to achieve. You're starting to see aspects of that falling into place, right? So the United States, for example, has some interesting bilateral discussions with Japan and South Korea. There's the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. That's Australia, India, Japan, and the United States talking about these issues. There's the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. But still, you need a larger grouping to really have that connective tissue, because we can't treat all these technology areas as distinct silos because they're very much entangled. And so you need a larger group. And there's various proposals out there, anywhere from 10 to 14 countries. But that, I think, ultimately is what we have to build towards if we want to be able to create a secure technological future for ourselves and be able to ensure long-term economic competitiveness. So much of this strategic competition is about technology, and we need to focus more effort on making sure that from a broader technological competitive standpoint that we're making the sensible long-term decisions that we can maintain our advantages, and of course make sure that our societies can blossom and prosper going forward.
That's an excellent point. Emily, I'd like to come back to you. For those who may not be familiar with this concept of military civil fusion, they might say, well, in the United States, American companies also work with the government. I think it might be helpful to explain why it's different in China, particularly for the perspective of, there's a notion of a people's war, or that, in the US, we have a military that is actually defined under the Constitution with civilian control, and it is not in China. And whereas, the military has the capability to sort of enjoin or usurp the private sector for its particular intent. Do you see anything, the key difference for people to understand why this issue really matters? I mean, you could say, was it a strategy of China to sort of say, let's get the IT sector and sort of win it over, and then we're going to build the infrastructure. We're going to put our products into the, make it the infrastructure of the world with Belt and Road and so on. And then we don't need to hack anymore. We'll just have access to the world's information, and we'll be able to be in charge.
No, so it's a great question, and I've gotten it a few times now, especially over the last few years. And one of the big differences, or kind of the key difference that I throw out usually when we're talking about the differences between U.S. and China MilSIP fusion. Well, first of all, the Chinese have kind of second player advantage here because they have sat here and watched what the United States has done in terms of MilSIP fusion, and there's plenty of academic literature out there from Chinese universities, from PLA universities, talking about, the pros and cons, or kind of the things that the U.S. has done right or wrong in terms of MilSIP fusion. One of the actual, the Chinese love to point to SpaceX as like the perfect example of MilSIP fusion. So there are, the two systems are kind of built initially kind of off of, well, I would say China has kind of tried to model some of its system off of what the U.S. has done. The big difference when it comes to China, though, is and kind of the comparison that I go to usually is, for instance, if the Navy here in the United States reaches out to MIT or reaches out to, my alma mater, the University of Michigan, and says, hey, you guys are really good at X. We'd really like you to help us build this component or help us develop this type of technology. And we're going to pay you X amount of money. Universities in the United States, and even companies too, have the ability to say no. They can say, no, thank you, we're fine. And, we've seen this with Google saying that they won't work with the Pentagon. We've seen other companies do this as well. But the difference we see in China is that there's not that same ability to say no. And that is not just because of relationships in China. It's also because of the way the system is built. For instance, universities in China the majority of them are under the Ministry of Education. There are a handful, like I said, under the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, but they're wholly owned by the government. And, we do have public universities in the United States, but they are much more decentralized than what we see in China. And so the problem that we kind of see then with MilSIP fusion is that because these universities or state-owned enterprises or things like that are under the auspices of whatever government department oversees them, they don't have the ability to say no because it's their parent company who is, or parent entity or parent organization that's telling them to do X, Y, and Z thing. So this is kind of the bigger issue when we see, what China is doing as far as MilSIP fusion. And the kind of bigger piece of it too is that under Xi Jinping, MilSIP fusion has, like I said, been elevated to this national level strategy. China is really trying to build MilSIP fusion into this kind of national integrated strategic system where it really encompasses everything. So you've got the IT sector, you've got, the education sector, you've got, the rail sector, anything you can kind of imagine, because there's a big component of MilSIP fusion that is defense mobilization, or how China kind of phrases it, economic mobilization for national defense. Which is kind of something that has existed, but again, has been elevated under Xi Jinping. So this is where we see the issues associated with things, Rosalind, you mentioned at the beginning, backdoors that, we talked about with Huawei and things like this. It's again, not necessarily the individual companies or individual entities in China that we're worried about, but it's more of the system in which they sit, the system in which they exist that can compel them to share information or share technology.
Yes, that's it's very hard to say no. And by the way, no judicial redress. Let's say you don't want to work with the Chinese government. So we have some questions coming in from the audience. I'm happy to see. I'm going to make sure that I get a chance for everybody to weigh in. So we have something from a consumer perspective. In practical terms, should people use Lenovo laptops? Should I use the TikTok app? Should I stop buying DJI drones? Jordan, I'm going to go to you. As you can see there, what would you say to consumers who are asking these kind of questions?
So I would say that the reason for the covered list is for sort of two reasons. One is to stop companies from receiving funds from the U.S. government, either in terms of grants or subsidies, if they use equipment that's on the covered list. So that's a way to sort of, as Colin was saying, rip and replace. The second reason why is to sort of caution people, to say to them, you can use this equipment, at least for now. I know that the commissioner was speaking about the proposed rule, which would prohibit authorization in the first place. But at least in current terms, you can use the equipment, but here's a cautionary situation where you may not want to use the equipment because the personal information that's being siphoned off, or the types of personal information that you're giving over in order to actually use the equipment, such as TikTok, where you actually have to give a lot of personal information or it can be siphoned. The Commerce Department has studied this extensively, how sometimes even without people's knowledge, TikTok will take information and then put it back in servers in China. You may not want to use it, right? So we're not telling you you can't use it. We're just saying that if you value your privacy or if you value the national security of the United States, then you probably shouldn't.
That's a great point. So we have other questions here around. Let me bring this over to you, Colin, around let's say the technology ecosystem. And obviously you're representing lots of firms who are involved in the technology ecosystem. Do they want to know, does this hurt America as a place for collaboration? And is the US becoming more insular if it's highlighting, these 5 or 6 firms? What does that mean for the other players?
Well, I think this kind of touches into something I was mentioning earlier, which is, we are working with our trusted allies. I know Japan was mentioned, Australia, England, and we're not alone in targeting the companies that have been on the entity list, the Huawei's and ZTEs of the world. And one of the biggest harms to kind of global trusted ICT companies has been the rise of kind of state-sponsored companies that have subsidies that allow you to undercut, in certain procurements, they'll offer options at 30% of cost, which is just impossible for anyone without that kind of background to even compete with. So while I can see why someone would ask if that makes the US more insular, we're not at all acting alone in this. We're working with, our core allies, and we're trying to make sure that 10 years down the road, we're only looking at one option between one other company and a Huawei. That's what we're trying to avoid. So in the end, we're working with our allied companies in Norwegian countries, South Korea with Samsung, for example. It's not at all a US way or nothing else at all. We're really trying to take a global approach here.
Yes, it's interesting. If there is a research organization that filed in the FCC called IPVM, they are doing research on the video surveillance market, and they were discussing Hikvision and Hytera, Dahua, which are also on the covered list. And they note that for the these are the cameras that are used in banks and not many public places, which are recording your face, and running algorithms that have been developed under unethical conditions in Western China. But in any case, that there are at least 40 manufacturers of non-PRC origin for these existing products. So it stands to reason that maybe what the FCC is doing is actually making a level playing field for the lawful providers of equipment, and that we may see more competition as a result of this by removing those players who are not being by the rules, who are doing predatory practices. I think we've seen that, and maybe Martijn, you could comment on this, but with the Huawei restrictions, Samsung has actually emerged. They were having a hard time to win contracts in some countries for 5G, and now Samsung has come aboard because maybe the one player that was monopolizing the market or doing the predatory practices. When you take the monopolist out of the picture, other companies can emerge.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, one of the biggest challenges Western firms face is Chinese industrial policy. It's just extremely difficult to go up against a system where a government is willing to provide tens of billions of dollars in subsidies to just one company, and this is happening across the board. And there's some very serious long-term repercussions to those actions, right? I mean, China has been very successful in cornering the market on very important inputs to global supply chains. So critical minerals, for example. Just today, the Financial Times reported how energy shortfalls in China are affecting the production of magnesium. So 85% of the world's magnesium is produced in China. That's a necessary element to be able to make aluminum. And so the ripple effects of that then are that you could have the global automotive industry come to a grinding halt because they can't manufacture cars. That's on top of of course, the semiconductor shortage for automobiles now as well. And that's just one of many examples that shows how China's mercantilist and techno-nationalist economic policies are creating huge headwinds for the global economy. And so when you take that and look at it from a macro perspective, that points to how important it is that we reset the playing field, right? Where the globalization, the pendulum has swung so far in one direction that we're all of a sudden now realizing how brittle the whole system is. And again, what we're talking about today, just with DGI, is just one snippet of that much larger picture, and why it's so important that these actions are being taken so that we can reintroduce the vendor diversity, the dynamism, and the healthy competition that you want to have in a global economic system.
Well, panel, I wish we had more time. There is so much more to discuss on this issue, and I hope you'll join us again. And I want to thank our audience today for joining us at China Tech Threat. Please join our newsletter. You can sign up on our website. Please follow us on Twitter at China Tech Threat. And I thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.